How are you doing? So good to see you. A long time.
Thank you. So I've got a story I can tell you about that at the end.
Right. Where's Zach? Thumbs up, Zach.
Like that?
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited about this special edition of Pivotal States. I'm Chris Chivvis, the director of the Carnegie Endowment American Statecraft program. And Pivotal States is a series of events that we've been doing where we explore U.S. relations with some of the world's most important countries. Today, we're here to talk about Russia, which obviously is one of the most important bilateral relations, not just for Washington, but also for the world. As anyone who's here today knows, the relationship with Russia has plummeted to an all-time low, or at least certainly a low since the end of the Cold War, on account of Russia's bloody invasion of Ukraine. But like it or not, Russia is still a global power. It has a nuclear arsenal. It has outsized influence in energy markets. And it has warm relations, not just with US adversaries like China, Iran, and North Korea, but also importantly with a lot of the world's emerging powers, countries like Indonesia, Brazil, and even India. So the question that I've been asking myself and that I want to discuss today is, what kind of a strategy should the United States be thinking about when it comes to its broader relationship with Russia, especially beyond Ukraine? And I'm delighted to have two fantastic experts, in fact, two of my favorite experts, not just in Russia, but also in foreign policy in general, here to talk to me about this today. To my right is Fiona Hill, who is a senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. And sitting to my far right is Andrew Weiss, who holds the James Family Chair here at the Carnegie Endowment, and is also the vice president of our Russia-Eurasia program. Thanks so much for being with me here today with all of us. Sometimes a good way to get started on these conversations is to take a historical perspective. And we were having a little bit of a chat about this yesterday, the three of us. And I wonder, Fiona, if you could sort of go back 20 years ago, say to the turn of the century, this century, and talk a little bit about how the relationship looked then and how we were thinking about US interests when it came to Russia.
Well, I'm glad, Chris, that you mentioned the turn of this century, because I think sometimes when we're talking about the history, particularly of Russia and all those relationships, we keep going back to earlier centuries. And of course, Putin tried to take us back to the 9th century in his recent interview with Tucker Carlson. So we're not going to do that today.
Let's not do that.
No, let's not do that. But I mean, if we do think about, back to the 2000s, this is when Putin was basically selected by Boris Yeltsin to be his replacement. 99, 2000, he gives this big speech. Putin does on the millennium, basically on the turn of this century, saying that he's going to put Russia kind of back. At least on a firm footing. He doesn't necessarily say that he's going to kind of put Russia back on this, kind of astride the stage and the world stage, or, kind of put Russia in the kind of position that we would be looking at it now. And I think the initial view of Putin, and Andrew has a great book that I'm going to plug right where I was kind of promised Andrew I'll do that, The Accidental Tsar, which is a graphic version of the graphic life of Vladimir Putin. We'd say kind of a graphic novel or a kind of a, but it's not a novel. It's certainly graphic non-fiction. And, I don't know whether we would have envisaged Putin becoming this kind of accidental Tsar or this kind of, figure, this kind of colossus in a sort of Russian historical perspective right then in that period of 2000. He was just coming out of a stint for quite some time as a deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, where he'd been pretty pragmatic in terms of dealing with businesses in the city. He'd had a stint, a very brief stint in the larger government of Boris Yeltsin as in sort of charge of Kremlin property. And he then had also a brief tenure as the head of the Federal Security Agency, the FSB, which was the successor to the KGB. And of course, everybody knew about him, that he'd been in the KGB and had risen up through his ranks. But he was really kind of accidental in many cases as being such a prominent figure. So I think if we look back at that period, you know, we have a very different view of a Putin. And I think we had different sets of expectations. We saw him as being pragmatic, business-oriented. Nobody really knew at the time, you know, who he was and, you know, kind of what his intentions might have been. He was somebody who said he wanted to restore Russia's general position at home. The country was pretty much insolvent, had lost many of its positions. And if we look at the first period in which he is in office as president, he really seems to set about fixing the economy and fixing some of the political structures. And Russia looked set to being, you know, genuinely part of the G7 or the G8 of the major economic powers. And that seemed to be his goal early on. So, you know, it depends on what you pick as your historical point. But if we're going back, you know, to that period of 25 years ago, that's kind of, we would have had all these questions and we would have had a different perspective.
And he was clearly not a Democrat at the time. I mean, we might have hoped for the eventual evolution of Russian politics towards greater democracy, but he was not a Democrat, but we thought we could have a pragmatic relationship of some kind with him, despite what were clear differences over a range of issues of European security, even arms control at the time, even though
it was like the Margaret Thatcher idea about Gorbachev, that it was somebody at least you could do business with. Mm-hmm. And there was many people in the US government and elsewhere who had got to know him as much as one could get to know him in that context of St. Petersburg in the 1990s and said, well, look, he just seems like a practical guy. I mean, yes, former KGB, but not somebody who, you know, you would have expected. I mean, there's something to be said about all of that, but, you know, not somebody that they would necessarily have expected to be doing the kinds of things that he is today.
Mm-hmm. Good. Andrew, I mean, is that your recollection as well of how we looked at U.S. interests? I'd love to hear, you know, your description of how you saw it then in particular, and then we could talk a little bit about how it looks today.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for including me in this series, and it's great to share the stage with Fiona. I think if you go back to the mindset of U.S. policymakers after the collapse of the Cold War in the late 1980s, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the world is now just utterly unrecognizable because we had a sense that Europe would be whole and free, that the threat of, you know, a direct confrontation between Washington and Moscow was unthinkable. The idea that Russia would be back on the world stage in the way Fiona described it. Again, these were things you would have been laughed out of the room if you had projected that we would be, you know, staring down.
As of 1991.
Yeah,
right. Yep.
Right.
Absolutely.
So, right. So now, you know, it's a significant amount of time has passed, and Russia has, you know, under Putin's leadership, reasserted a lot of its influence in the world. It has restored its, you know, sense of order at home after a period of a lot of incoherent governance and a lot of, you know, a lot of challenges at home. You know, it's a different place. What I think in terms of our interests, though, we need to come back to basics, and we need to think about what those interests actually are, as opposed to asserting a kind of preference about what Russia should look like domestically, because we don't, frankly, get a vote on that. And so by dint of Russia's nuclear arsenal, it's the second largest nuclear power. We have a big stake in how the U.S.-Russian competition in the strategic realm unfolds with the collapse of what remains of the Cold War era arms control infrastructure. That will be gone in early 2026 unless something unexpected happens. Second is what I said earlier, we have returned to a world where the possibility of full-scale war in Europe is not just a fantasy, it's reality. We are living that every day, and the people of Ukraine have suffered tremendously. And Russia has shown that it's willing to use almost all attributes of its national power to go to war against a neighboring country that did nothing to justify what Russia has done in its criminal war. Third, and this is, I think, the place where it starts to get more complicated, is that Russia remains one of the world's biggest producers of hydrocarbons. And so it is structurally meaningful to our prosperity and to the health of the global economy to have access to those resources for the global economy as the belated transition to a green economy unfolds. And then fourth, where it starts to get, I think, really sticky, and this is where I'll conclude, is the fact that Russia is increasingly a rogue state. And the way Russia exercises its influence on the world stage, in addition to being aimed at knocking the US down to size, throwing us off balance, all the kind of asymmetrical things that people like Fiona have had to deal with in government for the better part of a decade. Russia engages in genocidal activity in the territory of Ukraine and war crimes, crimes against humanity on a massive scale. It has used staged a nerve agent attack on the streets of a major British city in 2018. The list, of other horrible things the Russian government engages in, we could spend the whole time talking about it. But that's what Russia is now, and it's increasingly a partner of China and a partner or a sponsor of what one colleague at the State Department very memorably called the axis of jerks in terms of its partnership with Iran and North Korea. So it's a meaningful force. I wouldn't exaggerate or inflate the threat that it poses to our interests, but we need to kind of start from there and think about what a strategy or a policy that's suited to that challenge should look like.
I completely agree, and what I heard there were two different things though. I mean, I heard you identify some specific interests and then a warning about Russia, and they're both obviously very important to developing strategy. But just so I can go back to the interests, the first one was just the reality that Russia has a large nuclear arsenal and, at least in the strategic domain, could be considered a peer of the United States, especially complicated in a world where China may be going up to that same level of nuclear capability. So that's an interest that we have to address. Another one was the fact that it has a large influence over global energy markets, and that this is, at least for the foreseeable future, going to be something that the United States needs to be concerned about. And obviously you also mentioned Ukraine, which is, tell me if I've got it right, indicative of the fact that Russia does pose a threat to the European security sphere. So those would be the top three. And obviously all the other things you said about Russia being a very problematic power in the way that it has pursued its foreign policy over the course of the last years are also true reasons for concern. Fiona, do you agree with those? What else would you add to the list?
I do agree with those. I mean, I think there's and also a different formulation on the energy front as well, which is, rooted in the vast landmass that Russia occupies. I mean, we tend to think about it and have, most increasingly recently because of Ukraine as a European power. And of course, we'll remember that President Obama most famously, referred to Russia as a regional power after the first incursions into Ukraine.
Was that right? Is it
and I was about to say it's not, because it's a multi-regional power. And it might look differently in terms of its exertion of power in different places. But Russia is very much a power in Central and South Asia by extension, because we've lumped Central and South Asia, together in some of our geopolitical thinking. Its longest border is with China. It's not actually with Europe. China and Mongolia to the east. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why, Russia and China, so much of a factor together. And of course, it has a very large, regional presence in terms of landmass, but not in terms of population in the Northeast Asia and the Asia Pacific. It has now complete control of the Sea of Okhotsk. It has disputes with Japan, for example, territorial disputes. And then it's the Arctic power, par excellence. It has the largest coastline in the Arctic. And as things shift in the Arctic with global warming and the opening up of the northern seas, Russia is basically astride those critical routes. So as we think about a changing world in which its climate is changing and demography is changing, that landmass of Russia becomes pretty significant. China sees the northern sea routes as a means for moving from the Pacific to the Atlantic. I think Russia's actually comfortable with China's view of the northern sea routes in that way. But Russia becomes a multifaceted and multi-regional factor. And then, of course, it's also a factor in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And this is another area where, I think in terms of all the things that Andrew has laid out here, where we have to be concerned. In 2015, when Russia intervened in Syria, it made itself a major player in the Middle East in ways that it hadn't before. We were caught somewhat unawares by that. Yeah. We were totally surprised by that. We were less surprised by some of the things it's done elsewhere. Right. But you now have Russia as a factor in the three regions that are most concerned to us at the moment. Europe by default, really. I mean, I think we've been trying to move away from that for some time, but Russia's pulled us right back, as Andrew's saying, and you're saying here as well. It's a major security threat to Europe now, which European partners have woken up to and are really trying to do something about. But it's a major element in the Middle East. It's jettisoned its relationship with Israel after October 7th and after Hamas's attack on Israel, and has basically been making more common cause with Iran in ways that it wasn't previously. I mean, we can talk a little bit more about that. But of course, Iran has been brought into the conflict in Ukraine as a weapons provider for Russia. So you've got a kind of almost a sort of quasi-Russia-Iranian axis. I wouldn't go too far, but in terms of what you see in the Middle East and in Ukraine playing off against each other. And then in terms of the Asia-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific, or the, depending on how you want to formulate that, certainly Northeast Asia, Russia is a major factor. And in terms of rogue state going rogue, Russia has most recently embraced North Korea in ways that it did not previously, certainly not when we go back 20, 25 years ago, because of North Korea's own role in supplying armaments in Ukraine. And now we worry that Russia is not just going rogue, but is even shifting perhaps even the nuclear balance in that regard, where previously it was opposed to Iran and North Korea both getting nuclear armaments. We're not so sure now. And I think that first element of Andrew's concern about our interest, Russia has thrown those all up into a major question mark. We're not in the same kind of nuclear environment that we were, let's just say, 2 or 3 years ago, let alone 20, 25 years ago.
So, I mean, it's extremely complex, what the situation that you both are describing. And despite the vital, importance of what's happening in Europe right now, obviously touches on, again, a range of global U.S. interests. I mean, how do we begin to think about what an appropriate strategy toward Russia could look like, especially if we project forward 5 or 10 years, by which time, we can really hope that the war in Ukraine will have ended in some form or another. I mean, how do we think about dealing with this massive complexity that is Russia? I mean, it's not going to be able to do anything, probably it will just be a spoiler. Would you agree with that? Or can it do more in these other regions, in the Middle East?
I personally think it can do a lot more, but, maybe
so how do we start developing a strategy that can deal with this, again, the reality of a global Russia? Andrew, what are your thoughts?
So there's so much that's unknowable, right? We don't know how the war will end. We don't know how long the Putin regime will endure. My gut and sort of baseline is the war will go on for a long time and the Putin regime will endure for a long time. So we should build a strategy that is sustainable, that, like the strategy we had in the Cold War, wasn't predicated on the idea that Joseph Stalin was going to fall down in the shower. Like, it's a strategy that is going to, assume that Russia will be a formidable problem for the United States. It doesn't exaggerate or inflate Russia's capabilities, that prioritizes our alliances, that prioritizes the need to have credible, strong deterrence in place, especially in places like Europe, where Russia most directly threatens our interests, that addresses the challenge that's posed by Russia's nuclear arsenal, as we lose the arms control mechanisms for transparency and for restraint that have been in place for decades, and that we set priorities. Because right now, I mean, I appreciate everything the Biden administration's done to contend with this nightmare that was thrust upon them. But there is a vortex of emergency planning that people have been unfortunately sucked into for the better part of 2 years since the intelligence first arrived in the fall of 2021. And so the urgent crowds out the strategic. And I think, from, obviously looking at political dysfunction in this town and the possibility of a return of Donald Trump as the next US president, all the things that I just said are the key pillars of our policy could be out the window in January of 2025. And I think we need to be honest about that as a realistic possibility. And if that does happen, and you see that, the tarnishing of alliances like happened in the first Trump term, or you see a continued affinity for Russia, that's a real problem, a real fundamental structural problem. And I mean, I look to you as the expert on Europe to imagine what a world looks like where the US has, pulled back from NATO or, created a kind of, a paper promise to be the backstop of European security.
Can I add just another thing to this as well, because I know that you're going to as you're thinking about this yourself, wanted to sort of jump in here, but I think we've also set ourselves up with some false choices in terms of priorities in this regard. Because I think what Andrew said about trying to prioritize things is pretty essential. But we've got ourselves also into a mindset that the choices between dealing with Russia or dealing with China. And I think what I've tried to sketch out and what Andrew's also been talking about and what we've already acknowledged is a very complex situation here, where we have to look at Russia in the 360-degree totality here, a very huge state, touching on so many other arenas of which we're concerned, interacting with a number of countries, China included, that we have concerns about. So we don't have a binary choice here of kind of focusing on Russia and on China. And Russia's web of relationships, its network of relationships, is pretty important as well. Because we tend to forget sometimes, because we do put things in the silo of Europe. We think of Russia as a European player, the regional player, that Russia has global relationships as well. It did retrench and pull back from those in the 1990s, in many respects by the force of the fact that the country was insolvent and couldn't afford to keep up bases in Vietnam or, kind of elsewhere, Cuba, for example. But it didn't erode all those relationships. And Putin, because of being in the KGB and, some of the other roles that he's had and the people around him, they've had that whole web of intelligence relationships with places like Mexico, for example, Venezuela, Angola, Mozambique, places that we used to think about in the Soviet period, but we just didn't think about in the intervening period. And we've discovered that Russia can make mischief in different places, sending out paramilitary forces like the Wagner Group into Africa and nipping the backsides of the French all over the place where they weren't thinking about it, in Mali and Niger and places, for example. So that might not be our priority, but we have to kind of find a way of, when we set priorities, of remembering that they've got pieces to play all over the place and trying to kind of think of a 360 perspective. So what matters most to us, but not then also setting ourselves up with a false choice between a kind of a focus on Russia and Europe or China and Asia, because we're in a global world and a lot of other countries have their own relationships with Russia and see Russia in very different ways than we do.
If I could just tag on, the other piece which I think absolutely has to be front and center is the role of leverage in dealing with Russia, because the Russians are masters at identifying and creating leverage wherever possible in their relationship with us. And what was such a wonderful aspect of this tragedy since February 2022 is that the Russians were finally on the back foot and we were applying maximum pressure and leverage against them. That's changed as the dynamic on the battlefield has shifted in Russia's favor in recent months. But I think it has to be sort of front and center in how we think about our strategy. It can't just be sloganing and telling ourselves how great we are and how discredited Russia is and what a bad guy Putin is. Like, that's all baked in. But if you want to actually influence Russia's behavior, you're going to only do that if you develop real leverage.
So how do you do that?
So right now the key, and I'm sorry we're getting sucked into a conversation about Ukraine. Ukraine really is the, for now.
I just don't want to talk only about Ukraine.
Yeah, that is the crux of the success of any Western policy going forward, is making sure that Russia pays extremely high cost for what it's doing, that it comes away from this war feeling that it can't do it again, that it can't wait us out, and it can't have a second go at it.
How do you know when that has been achieved?
I think that if the war were to stabilize into a stalemate, as horrible as that sounds, in which there is, no longer a sense that Ukraine could collapse or lose its sovereignty beyond what's been lost since February of 2022,
but it's not going to lose
that would
much more
be
territory, at least.
Right. That would be a great starting point. That we could create some form of a sense, as we help Ukraine rebuild and then we help it develop a credible military force that deters a future round of Russian aggression, that we now would have a more stable dynamic between those two states. Getting there is going to be extremely difficult because right now, as we see, the Western political will is questionable. You have the possibility of a major breakdown in US support coming in November, depending on who wins the US election. And then you have just kind of a sense of sort of dithering in Europe on certain level, that they would rather focus on other problems and rather not have to make the costly investments in national defense that are absolutely required. So unless we all kind of recognize the world has changed, just as we had to deal with COVID or other challenges, we can't get a credible stance in place to support Ukraine for the long term.
Fiona, is leverage a key part of an effective future strategy towards Russia? And if so, what does it look like?
It is. It's leverage in relationships as well with other countries.
Right.
And I think that that's kind of an important element of this as well. I mean, Andrew described this as kind of a stalemate. I mean, I think we're kind of sometimes challenged in finding the right word to describe, kind of what we mean here. Because, a stalemate might just give the impression that both sides have fought themselves to a standstill, which is probably really not what we mean here. I mean, right now, what Russia has done has, basically dug itself out or dug itself in literally with all the trenches and anti-tank and the mines that it has laid down on along the territory that it's taken for Ukraine so far. I mean, it has basically now dug itself in and moved itself away from what would have been a sort of strategic defeat in terms of trying to take over all of Ukraine, but it's obviously hell-bent on keeping territory that it's already seized. And what we have to do is to make sure they can't go any further, and then try to kind of figure things out from there. So it's helping Ukraine prevail and showing Putin and showing the rest of the world that war
of not losing.
Yes, that war does not work. And I mean, I think that's basically the problem, because right now there is a sense in other parts of the world, a very clear sense that Russia has won. Now, part of that's Russians' propaganda, Putin's own propaganda. He won in the ballot box in March, bit of a weird victory, really, when you've got no competitors and the main competitor dies a month before the elections, and then you overfulfill the plan with a ridiculously high vote that, kind of nobody, really believes in. But nonetheless, Putin's basically saying he's politically secure at home, and now he's winning on the battlefield. Now, I think we could debate that, really. But the point is, he's shown to the rest of the world that he's a winner. And you can really hear from the commentaries in other parts, be it in Latin and South America, Africa, Asia and elsewhere, this idea that Russia now dominates in Eastern Europe again, that Russia's turned the tide, which of course, again, is not the case, and that the West is weakened.
So, but why does it matter? Why does it matter? Because I think you think it matters.
Because it matters because then Putin has described the war now not just against Nazis or against Ukraine, but a war against NATO, the United States, and the West. And what he is basically saying is the West is weak and the United States is weak. And we look very weak ahead of our elections, and given all of the upheaval here in the United States, upheaval in Europe as well, the European Union elections coming up, elections in countries worldwide. We've got 64 elections, but major ones in European countries, the UK, for example. Putin's basically saying, I'm sitting pretty, I'm re-elected, I'm here for the next 6 years, I could be here for even longer, you're going to have to deal with me, and I can prevail. And so we have to show, through diplomacy, as well as all of the other issues that Andrew is laying out here, that absolutely no, we can prevail, we can, basically stay the course here, we can assert security, and we are not weak. And that is kind of part of the problem, because we get leverage in those relationships with other countries that right now are sitting back and, thinking that Russia's won or that they want to deal with Russia, by appearing stronger, more resolute and, resilient. Because Putin is playing a game of strength elsewhere in the world. There are countries that actually want Russia to remain strong as a counterweight for China, for example, in the case of India. I mean, preposterous as that might seem, India actually sees Russia as a counterweight to China, even though we would say that, now Russia is anything but that. It is more in the Chinese camp. Others want Russia to be a counterweight to us, in international affairs. And so there's so many other countries in the world that just don't want to see Russia lose its position. And right now it's a kind of a question is Russia stronger than, the United States and the West in terms of politics and performance.
So any future strategy towards Russia is going to involve a large dose of deterrence and leverage.
And containment.
And containment or
well,
constrainment.
Towards the end, potentially of some form of containment.
Yeah.
My thinking about strategies is that deterrence is almost always an essential part. So is diplomacy.
Yeah.
So that's the more difficult part right now when we think about Russia. Nobody wants to talk about it. Is it possible? I mean, do you think it can be an element in a future strategy toward Russia?
Well, it has to be.
Say after Putin,
it has to be. I mean, you're meaning with Russia itself and then more broadly, correct?
Yes,
I mean,
of course,
meaning in terms of
also with Russia, but
Russia
certainly
itself.
you were getting it
leverage
with other powers.
Yeah, I mean, we have to have a much more robust and more broad-minded and, again, 360-degree perspective on our diplomacy. Mm-hmm. So when I was in, the previous administration, I just want to use this as a quick illustration, and then I'm sure Andrew's got some things to say about this as well. There was the crisis over Venezuela when Maduro was clearly not re-elected. And some people here in the audience actually looking around will probably remember this, in fact. And we were trying to get support with Europeans, it wasn't just the United States, for some transition to Juan Guaido. And it was a massive diplomatic effort. And it fell down because we just didn't do our homework on what other countries felt. And they started to think it was all about the United States. It wasn't about Venezuela at all. And all the memories of the United States interventions in Latin and South America and in Panama or Haiti or Cuba, we had so much baggage. And although we were actually trying to do something that was straightforward and made a lot of sense for the future of Venezuela, we fell down because we didn't realize about how other countries thought about us and our diplomacy there. And although the Europeans were still on board, we didn't do our homework with the Mexicans, for example, the Colombians, Brazilians. We basically failed at what should have been actually a pretty straightforward diplomatic effort. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of, I think, problem that we face overall. Of course, then the Russians ran in, to help prop up basically Maduro.
Right.
And became a spoiler in that. And they wouldn't have been, had we had a much more robust diplomatic
or understanding
effort,
of how
or
our
understanding of how the dynamics
are
playing.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to do. And it's the same with Russia. We need to understand, how our diplomacy is kind of affecting their calculations.
And then just to add two things to what Fiona said, which I agree with. Communication to encourage deconfliction and risk reduction is not a reward to Russia. And we've seen Jake Sullivan, CIA Director Bill Burns, and others engage with Russian counterparts at dangerous moments when Russia has looked like it might potentially use nuclear weapons. In the case of the withdrawal from Kherson, there have been instances where it was important to have lines of communication open. I'm not expecting those lines of communication to become robust or to be restored anytime soon. Russia is using a kind of strategy of being as aloof and inaccessible as possible to both penalize us by saying, if you're not willing to cut off your support for Ukraine, we can't talk to you about arms control, so they're applying linkages where there shouldn't be any. But to my mind, Russia deliberately creates dangerous situations, and the situations, like you see with this, recent focus on GPS jamming in and around the Baltic Sea, Russia wants to make the world dangerous. It wants to make us back off and use tools like that to intimidate and test our resolve. And so any strategy that involves diplomatic outreach also has to be sort of undergirded by serious resolve and a sense that we're not going anywhere, we're not bothered, we're steady, we mean business. And the president's comments at the beginning of the war about defending every inch of NATO territory, it had its desired effect.
Yeah, I think we also have to be very creative and try to get a few steps ahead, which we haven't been very good at all, as Andrew's laying out here. Because one of the Russian approaches, it's kind of the stance with its neighbours is to start hitting them, and then saying that a compromise is just to stop hitting. This is a kind of a classic in negotiation. You were kind of pretty much saying the same sort of thing.
Well, that's leverage from their end.
It's leverage, exactly. And it's a classic leverage. Would you like me to stop hitting you now? Yes, please. So that's kind of where we are. So we have to try to kind of get ahead of that and figure that out and be creative ourselves, because we're often not really wising up to some of the approaches. And of course, we'd love them to stop hitting everybody for sure, and us too.
So, given the complexity of the Russia that we will be dealing with in 5 or 10 years, in a situation, especially where the war in Ukraine has come to some kind of, even if temporary, halt, it's hard for me to imagine that there's not a larger role for diplomacy here than simply talking to them about deconfliction. Arms control, you mentioned the nuclear reality. Is there nothing at all that we should be at least planning for, potentially discussing? How are we going to do arms control that many people would like to see with China, for example, if we don't have some kind of a relationship in that sphere with Russia?
It would be, I think, advisable. The administration has put out proposals for re-engaging with the Russians on these issues. And as I said a second ago, they are not open for that conversation.
But we should be open to it.
Yeah,
but,
and I think
right.
And I think that's I think it's basically an unchallenged idea. The problem is there is a record of Russia violating arms control treaties, including its deployment of a missile that was not compliant with the INF treaty.
Right.
And so the idea that we're going to now be able to rectify past violations of Russian treaty obligations and submit to the Senate a future arms control agreement, like that just seems very politically
Not in the near term,
unrealistic
yeah.
in the near term. So I think the question is, can you do things, and I'm not an expert on nuclear arms control, that amount to executive understandings and reciprocal steps that might alleviate the possible tensions arising from the collapse of the New START agreement, which expires in February 2026.
There are two elements to this that I think we could explore and start thinking about in terms of framing. I mean, one, as Andrew is basically suggesting is that we've the old system is broken down and we don't really have anything in place. And you just mentioned China. I mean, under the Trump administration, there was an idea, it was floated by people like Matt Pottinger about how you would engage China in a kind of a trilateral discussion with Russia over strategic arms. And that didn't really go anywhere for a whole variety of different reasons, but partly because it was so difficult trying to get the Russians on board on issues, let alone trying to figure out with the Chinese, who we didn't really have that kind of long history of talking about strategic relations with. But we've now got an even more complex situation because Putin has been so loose and free with talking about the use of basically intermediate and tactical nuclear weapons in particular, which is something that they didn't do before. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have not had that kind of nuclear grandstanding and saber-rattling from the Russians in an extraordinarily long time, and certainly not one in which we actually thought, we factored in all of this during the Cold War, but I mean, it's been a bit of a shock to the system to think that Putin was actually, contemplating bombing the Ukrainians with a tactical nuke because of, he was losing on the ground in Kherson. And of course, as we've all alluded to here, it took the Chinese, the Indians, not just us, the Japanese, the Indonesians, the UK, France, and others, to kind of basically put pressure on Putin to step back. So the question now is Russia over the longer term still committed to non-proliferation and to, basic old good strategic arms control hygiene? We're not really sure about this anymore. So we'd have to have an international frame. And also, what has happened in Ukraine is a violation of some of these precepts that we had before, because we gave Ukraine, the United States, the UK, and Russia in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, and I know everyone's eye-rolling, like, oh my God, we're going to talk about that again. I promise we won't. But the point is that, we basically gave an agreement that if they gave up nuclear weapons from the old Soviet arsenal, along with like Belarus and Kazakhstan, that they have some kind of assurances. And so the whole non-proliferation basket is all at question now. If you're a nuclear state, you can bully your non-nuclear neighbor, or you can, in the case of India and Pakistan, basically make all kinds of threats. If you're not a nuclear state, then maybe you need to start thinking about acquiring nuclear weapons. The Germans are talking about this for Europe now. The Japanese and others have raised it, the Saudis, the Turks, so we're in a different arena. So US diplomacy on the larger international front on nuclear issues actually, I think, could be very timely. So we could have a larger strategic stability discussion with a set of other players. I don't actually think that China particularly wants to have this rogue environment, for example. So there are things that we could do that might be able to frame a return to the strategic stability talks with Russia at an appropriate point. The second thing is also civilian nuclear front, because Russia has also proven to be somewhat rogue in that regard as well. And we have got that process with the International Atomic Energy Agency looking at the Zaporizhzhia plant in Ukraine. But, Putin sent troops through the Chernobyl exclusion zone. He's put the civilian nuclear production capacity of Ukraine under great risk. We already have an international process underway there that I think we could kind of pick up on. So, there are different ways in which we could get at this issue with the United States and pretty robust diplomacy, but it isn't going to be immediately with Russia. It's just how would we fit Russia in after the fact. Very
interesting. Everyone should have a card on their chair. If you'd like to submit a question, we're going to do it through your iPhone. Rather than in person, because that way we can also include questions from online. And I'm going to come to questions in a minute here, but you can submit them at any time if you just use that the card that's on your chair to get to the right part of the website. Let me ask a question. So what we've been talking about basically is what you might call the baseline scenario for Russia. And Andrew, you've made the case that this is the scenario that's most likely. We need to plan against it. We can't predict the future, however. So other scenarios are possible. People discuss them. I think it's not of much help to be Pollyannish and assume that Russia is going to completely transform overnight into a different society than the one that we're familiar with. But you can imagine relevant scenarios that are somewhat different from the Russia that we have been discussing, such as a Russia that retrenches out of its own estimation of its interests, for example.
Right. Perhaps
because it's paid too high of a cost, perhaps because of it's been successful in the sense, Andrew, that you would consider it, that it's paid such a high cost that this might not be Putin, but perhaps a future Putin, although you could even imagine Putin in 10 years potentially deciding the cost has been too high. Russia needs to retrench and reset its relationship with the world. Fiona, we talked a little bit about this the other day. I mean, what does that Russia look like, and how does it change the way in which the United States, our European allies, our Asian allies interact with Russia? A Russia that's trying to, at least to some degree, not change internally, but rebuild its relationship with the West and the democracies of the world.
Yeah, there's actually, we all refer to this, a good piece by Steve Kotkin in Foreign Affairs, looking at these kind of 5 futures for Russia, and retrenchment is obviously one of them that we've been talking about here. And if we look at other periods in Russian and Soviet history, we've had that. Lenin most famously, decided to end World War I with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk because he wanted to get on with consolidating, power after the Bolshevik Revolution. And it was kind of clear that many people around him had no intention of giving up that territory forever, because Stalin came right back along later, trying to kind of recoup and regain some of it. But at different points, one might have thought that things could have gone in a different direction because there's various treaties, Treaty of Rapallo and other periods in which, the Bolsheviks actually did try to arrange different sets of relationships with the West as they were focusing on things internally. I think a lot of possibilities are there, which actually, it might become a question about how do we manage it, not just how does it look for the rest of the world. I mean, there may be a sigh of relief, actually, for some countries, particularly countries like India, for example, who don't want to have to choose between these relationships.
Germany and others,
who don't want to be kind of forced into choosing, Russia, and would rather, have a relationship with them that if they started to patch things up. But I think the bigger dilemma would become, one of the cost to Russia that Andrew laid out for, basically waging the largest land war in Europe since World War II, and this, destruction of Ukraine and all the kind of knock-on effects. Because if you did have, say, as we're speaking now, Putin's choked on a grape, just some benign, kind of end here. You mentioned before Stalin slipping in the shower. Well, he had a stroke, of course, in his bedroom. So we don't know what's going to happen, but we could conceive not just of, Mr. Patrushev as the head of the Security Council, or somebody who is, from Putin's cohort in terms of age and outlook coming in, but maybe the son of Patrushev, or the, son of somebody else in the circle. Mr. Mishustin, the current prime minister, would be acting president for a period. He has a cabinet of technocrats around him, including Kirienko, who used to be the head of Rosatom, who's been very influential and was a reformer back in the 1990s, so we would, have said. Elvira Nabiullina, who was probably the world's greatest central banker. If we suddenly had this technocratic government, even for a short period of time, we'd be under a lot of pressure ourselves, to give Russia a pass, to try to patch up the relationship. So how would that look? For example, we'd have all these debates again we've had before about what happened after World War I in Germany. Or, should we then, think about Russia as Germany after World War II, and it'd be trying to improve that relationship and build forward. And then we'd have the big dilemma about what to do about Ukraine. If there was a kind of a Brest-Litovsk-like decision of a technocratic, Russian government, we're going to give this up. We might give some stuff back, but we're not paying for anything.
It might even be, relatively favorable to Ukraine.
It might well be, but not financially.
Right.
And then we have a big dilemma, because what Russia has done is created trillions of euros worth of damage and knock-on effects. So, and then there'd be a lot of questions about how is that going to affect other calculations elsewhere in the in the world, the Middle East, or elsewhere, because reparations or paying, for damage done, is a big issue all the time.
Certainly intensify the challenges that we have right now with countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia, who are very important to the future of world order. Andrew, what do you think? In that kind, I realize this is not the scenario that you think is most likely to be clear, but it is one that's possible and is being discussed by a number of people. So what do you think the strategy ought to be? What would you do?
I think that Russia's period of rapprochement with Western powers in the mid-1980s onward was anomalous. And the historical pattern of relations between Russia and Western Europe has been more in the 20th century and in the eras preceding that has been animated by a lot of chronic Russian insecurity, a lot of complexes of inferiority and backwardness. I don't think any of that disappears in the foreseeable future or under any foreseeable Russian regime. So it's a new security landscape that this, kind of technocratic Russia that Fiona has sketched for us would confront. And, the trivia question I always ask in settings like this that I think exemplifies the change in the security environment is how many US tanks were there deployed in Europe in 2014? And the answer is 0. Yeah. So Russia has single-handedly, or Putin single-handedly, has restored a sort of central focus for US and allied threat perceptions and planning focused on them. Yeah. There will be a more formidable NATO that is reinvigorated and animated by that threat. And there will be a permanently aggrieved Ukraine, which will be sitting right next door with a large military and a serious sense of need for revenge and retribution for the horrible crimes that Russia has committed. It is not a formula for, a kind of either easy retrenchment or easy reconciliation. And if Putin gets, God willing, hit by a bus tomorrow, which would be a wonderful outcome, it is going to be a really delicate situation for the United States and its allies to manage because the signals that a new Russian government sends are not going to be clear-cut. And they have a lot at stake, frankly, in their own self-preservation, given that the entire Russian leadership structure is directly implicated in this war. So it's going to be very hard to wash the stink off of themselves, having participated, willingly or under duress in what is a war of massive scale, yeah, in which their own criminality is just self-evident.
And there's also, other thing, I was sketching that out as let's just consider that, I think a bus running into the Kremlin walls, is kind of unlikely. The grip, could be a scenario. But, it's just, and if something happens to, Putin right now, there is a process. It just, we don't know, where it would end up and who would end up at the top, after all of this. But it's the kind of knock-on effects from what Putin has done with this choice of invading Ukraine that Andrew sketches out that are, very important here. And it's not just in Europe. There's the Arctic. Most of the Arctic powers, happen to be European, but also Canada, of course, and the United States. But there is also then in the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific. And Japan and South Korea have been very rattled by everything that's happened in Ukraine because of kind of the knock-on effects, and also because North Korea has been a party to this. Again, in the Middle East, the fact that Iran has become a party to the war in Ukraine, that China has become a party to this. It's that shifted the way that Europe and European countries individually and collectively have been thinking about China, for example. So there's a whole host of knock-on effects. And frankly, our own dithering about the war in Ukraine over the last several months, about the supplemental and continued support for Ukraine, has also shifted a lot of calculations as well. Maybe Russia's, to some extent, and Putin feeling that he's winning, but a lot of others in wondering about and this gets back to your fundamental point at the beginning, Chris, about the reliability of the United States as both a partner and an ally, but also as an international player. I would say that in Europe, as Andrew's suggesting now, you're going to have a much more robust NATO. We've also got a lot of European powers that are now fired up to think differently about European security. The Finns and the Swedes didn't just join NATO because it's the old NATO. They're now thinking very differently about a role that they would play in the creation of a new European security order, which might actually find us in a very different place, as well as, kind of others. And what's I thought was interesting recently, and of course there's still elections to be had in the European Union, was the fact that the former Finnish president, Sauli Niinistö, has been working with Ursula von der Leyen about actually thinking about how the European Union might rethink its security position. So it's not just about NATO, but about how you might reconceive of a European security. And then what kind of actor is a more empowered, maybe even more beefed up European, kind of military apparatus. I don't quite know what form it'll take. You and I talked about that some time ago. For example, I know everyone's looking at that at the moment. What does European security look like? And then, what are the implications of that on a more global perspective? Do we have more regional orders that are, very focused? Does whatever Europe decide to do, basically give ideas to countries elsewhere? I think we're in a whole new world as a result of this war in Ukraine.
Well, I obviously think that, if our European allies were able to take greater responsibility for European security, including through the European Union, that would be very good for the United States. And I think it would actually alleviate some of the strains that you have been describing over the course of this this discussion. I want to be sure to get to some of the questions from our audience. I have more questions I want to ask you. I could do this for hours and hours and hours. It's such a treat. Let me start with, we have a question about, it sort of drills down a little bit on some of the issues that you've raised about how emerging powers, the global south, other nations in the world fit into this equation. We have a question about Central Asia in particular. The question is, what approach should the United States take towards, countries in Central Asia who find themselves really dependent on Russia and China economically? They're getting bullied by Russia and China diplomatically, but they also have an aspiration to to sort of escape from the influence of those two major powers that are in their neighborhood.
I think we, based on all of the long experience that we've had in that region, need to tread a little bit carefully, because I think at various points, this is perceptions that have been imposed on, kind of what happened rather than, necessarily things that we were doing ourselves. There's been this idea that we were, remember this, I mean, we've been around for so long, the Great Game. I think we probably had some event here at Carnegie on that, topic, way back, when that idea that, especially as we started to get involved in energy development with the Chevrons and Exxons and others in Central Asia, that we were going to be recreating the Great Game between Russia and Great Britain over India, back in the 19th century. And I don't know whether Central Asian countries really benefited from that. There was kind of then feeling that there was going to be a clash between the US and the West and Russia. Then, of course, we did not translate that interest in energy and other investment into a major political position there. We had the war in Afghanistan, that diverted attention for a long time. Now, as you rightly put, China is the major player. There's all this tensions now between China and Russia. And I think, what we need to be focused on is thinking about how we give, countries in Central Asia, and elsewhere, the best possibility to diversify their options. Help them, as you were just laying out there, to not be kind of caught between a clash of two states with different sets of interests, because Russia and China's interests don't align, actually, in Central Asia at all either. But we have more limited capacity and interest, frankly, for investment, and especially after withdrawing in Afghanistan, somewhat less interest than we had before in the full kind of political disposition of the region. But we still retain interest in stability and in the way that the region develops. So I think, by having a reasoned and robust and consistent diplomacy and a set of economic and other political relations with the region is pretty critical, along with other.
Is there leverage? Is there leverage there that can be used with, just getting to Andrew's earlier point about leverage, that can be used without getting dragged into some kind of an overcommitment to states where, as you say, we don't have a great deal of interest?
I think with other relationships, look, Japan and South Korea, for example, have longer-standing relations there, not just because of rivalries with China or Russia, quite the contrary. I mean, there are Korean populations in Central Asia from, the deportations of Koreans from the Far East and Sakhalin to Central Asia. Korea has been heavily invested there in agriculture and other development. Japan sees this as West Asia, and the Japan International Bank for Cooperation and other entities have been there as well. The Germans at different points have been trying to craft a larger policy for the region. I think if we work together with other partners and allies there, we could have a much more effective policy. And I think that's the direction of travel, actually. But if we're kind of looking it up as if we're going to be a major player and pitting countries against China or Russia, that's not going to really be serving perhaps.
It would be a risk of getting
interests.
deeply involved in a region where our interests are limited, which would be a major mistake. That's something that we have to avoid. I mean, in some way, if the conflict is going to be as intense and as long-lasting as you've been describing, we have to think about how to keep costs down. I mean, the reality is that Russia will not be the only challenge that the United States faces over the course of the next 10 years. And so we have to be thinking about that as a part of any kind of a strategy. Another question for you from our audience, Andrew. I think this is for you, Fiona, obviously also interested in your views on this, and it has to do with conflict beyond conventional threats. We've been talking about conventional and strategic threats, but obviously there's gray zone, there's disinformation, there are other domains which are arguably as important and could become more important over the course of the next decades. I mean, how should the United States be thinking about its strategy to respond to the misinformation threat, for example, from Russia, in a way that doesn't escalate the problem? I mean, are there things that we should be incorporating into future strategy for dealing with global Russia?
In my mind, and this isn't an original thought, it comes from a colleague, I think you need to break this problem down into a couple of chunks. We can't control the information domain to our liking.
Right.
Like, particularly in our own country, where you have the presumptive nominee of a major political party trafficking in all sorts of untruth, and a media infrastructure that supports that. We have a lot of stuff we need to look in the mirror about and rectify in our own politics. So I'm somewhat dim on my expectation that either it's Russia's fault. I think we've basically set ourselves on fire through, and Fiona's spoken and written very eloquently about this. So I don't really expect to find a Russian hand in that, or yes, they can make it worse, but they're not the author of it. Yeah. I think there are basic questions as we go into the election season, and some of this has been demonstrated successfully in previous electoral cycles since 2016 to harden the tabulation and the actual election machinery that's spread out across our 50 different jurisdictions, which is, will the election be seen as free and fair? And as I was just saying, we have some problems in that respect in terms of parts of the political spectrum that are already, very skeptical and casting doubt about the validity of electoral results. And then third is the possibility of, continued efforts to hack and dump, major political figures to damage their reputation. And we saw that, spectacularly in 2016. It, has been tried in other contexts, like in the French election. It's a persistent challenge, and good cyber hygiene is about the only remedy for that. I would say that we see disinformation in different parts of the world that allows any number of actors, not just Russia, to destabilize societies, most visibly in the Sahel region over the past couple of years, where the things Russia has been good at and provides as a kind of service to regimes it's friendly with, like, it's a problem. But I do worry, and it comes back to your question about resources, that we can't run our foreign policy on the basis of countering 5 Russians with a fax machine. I'm being vulgar in my analogy here, and deploying ourselves to counter that everywhere it pops up. And we need to think about what really matters. We care about the upcoming European elections. We care about national elections in various parts of Europe. And Russia is now going to be a kind of persistent troublemaker in our domestic politics. I don't think that's going to change. And it's very hard to deter. So I think the best you can do is call it out. You can harden yourself. You can educate your societies. But it's certainly not something that's going to go away. I just wouldn't run around with my hair on fire, thinking I'm going to douse this issue and put it to rest. I think it's just the nature of the world we're in.
Should we forswear interfering in other countries' elections in order to try to set a norm that they shouldn't interfere in ours?
Well, I mean, I don't see the United States as a proponent currently of interfering in other countries.
Not under this administration, but we have in the past.
So, again, I don't think that's a smart strategy. I look at, efforts that we've had to promote regime change in parts of the world, and it hasn't worked out very well. So I'm not, not a big fan.
So I just mean reinforcing the idea of national sovereignty when it comes to internal political systems, including with Russia. Yeah. Whether it would work, whether we would get what we wanted in terms of restraint on their part in interfering in our elections.
It seems fanciful to me to imagine the Russians abiding by some sort of sense of restraint. These are the tools they have. Like, they want to mess with us, and they know we're richer, more powerful, and better equipped in all these areas. And these are the tools they have to throw sand in Gulliver's face. Like it's who they are.
Yeah.
It is for the for the benefit of others out there, very important for us to be very clear about what we're doing in an international frame on that score. Because I do think about Venezuela, which I brought up, right? I mean, we were not interfering in the Venezuelan election, although everybody was remembering what we'd done in the past, which was a lot,
Right.
in fact, in that neighborhood. And we had a very hard job persuading people we come in peace this time. We're actually trying to help solve a problem along with a few other friends here from Europe. So I mean, we're going to have to work ourselves on these kinds of issues. I mean, I think Andrew's laid out perfectly. I mean, at home it's fixing our own kind of problems with these issues domestically, but internationally, the United States gets back to your point about diplomacy as well. It's not just diplomacy with Russia; it's the way that we conduct our diplomatic relations and our overall relations with other parts of the world as well. For example, I mean, our relationship with our Mexican colleagues is terrible. And we forget that a lot of Mexicans studied in the Soviet Union, for example. I was just in Minneapolis, and I spent a year in the Soviet period in a Russian language institution, and found that the Mexican consul had been at the same institute at the same time and spoke, better Russian than most Russians. And people forget that there was all these ties that kind of Russia can draw into in terms of diplomacy, because we've got these old relationships with people. We take sometimes our relationship, particularly with neighbours, for granted, forgetting that they know others. So we have to basically, I think, work harder on our diplomacy and clearly articulate.
But again, with Mexico, the question of sovereignty is also important, because we may not take it seriously, but there are powerful voices in the United States arguing for military intervention in Mexico.
I know, exactly, which is why we have to be on the diplomatic level on the above. I mean, if we do something like that again, getting back to what Andrew was saying, well, I mean, all bets are going to be off. I mean, that would be, catastrophic for our international standing, let alone for our regional standing to, give in to those kinds of voices. And that's, of course, what Putin plays into. So getting back to what Andrew said again as well, while we have, people, saying these kinds of things in our own environment, it's, very difficult. As you said, they're not the author of these books, but they're certainly good at fan fiction, basically of kind of interpreting, what other people say as well. So that's, kind of what all those young guys and girls are doing, sitting around in these, factories in Russia writing fan fiction.
They're not reading Andrew's book, I take it.
No, sadly not.
We have a couple of questions about the axis of jerks, as Andrew quoted our friend in the State Department or in the government has referred to it. One is about Russia and Iran, so maybe we can start there, and then I want to talk about China. So how have power dynamics between Russia and Iran changed after Russia's war in Ukraine? Andrew, do you want to talk a little bit about how you see the impact? I mean, how much should we make, in other words, of the fact that Iran is supplying drones, potentially ballistic missiles, to Russia's war effort? Obviously, it helps Russia's war effort, but in the bigger strategic sense, how does that change their relationship?
I think the strategic impact of Russia's dependence on supplies from Iran and also North Korea is profound. It has made a huge difference on the battlefield, and we see Russia now catching, its breath and reinvigorating its own defense industry, and being able to produce at scale things that it's received from Iran, and the drone, operation that's being built in Tatarstan is the most vivid example of that. So I would say that actually does have strategic implications for our partner in Ukraine. Two is for all of its problematic behavior, Russia was a partner during the negotiation of the Iran nuclear deal and had an important role to play in implementation before the Trump administration withdrew. That now has shifted from being a country that wants to sort of see Iran stay non-nuclear to a country that's sort of providing a protective shield between Iran and the international community, which continues to put all sorts of concerns on the table about Iran's nuclear activities. So you see Russia move from neutral or generally favorably inclined to the international community's desire for Iran not to become a nuclear weapon state to a country that's now in some ways egging it on. In the case of Iran's role in the Middle East after October 7th, you've seen Russia be a cheerleader for Iran, a kind of flamboyant critic of Israel, and spend as much of its time as possible creating excuses for the risk of creating a smokescreen that basically sort of removes Russia as a responsible player from the other countries in the region and outside players that don't want to see escalation. So Russia, has been, I think, from the Israelis' perspective, has kind of pulled off the mask and shown itself to be no longer invested.
It's not great because Russia would benefit from the relationship with Israel. So this is also shooting itself in the foot in that regard. And it can only go so far, right, in its relationship with Iran because it's trying to do the same thing with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. I mean, it also wants a strong relationship with them. Is that correct?
I think Russia has retained a fair amount of its standing with the Gulf monarchies. It's retained a close relationship with Turkey. So it's been, historically pretty good at being a country that talks to everyone. But the rift with Israel looks more fundamental, and you see a real breakdown.
Interesting.
So that to me, again, it doesn't look smart, but it looks like what we all know, which is that Russia's foreign policy is now really focused on the war in Ukraine, and so everything gets instrumentalized,
exactly.
and it needs Iran as a partner to help win the war in Ukraine. So it's willing to do all sorts of inflammatory things in service of that goal.
And obviously the other country that it needs is China.
Yeah, and North Korea.
And
element here
North
in this
Korea.
as
But
well.
fundamentally China. I mean, North Korea, we don't know what direction it can go, how much munitions they can actually supply over time. But the China relationship is truly
I think
strategic.
we'd be worried about, though, the other direction in which, as a result of so much ammunition being sent by North Korea, that Kim Jong-un also asked for more assistance from Russia.
Right.
And
Nuclear
as Andrew was saying before, they were actually very helpful behind the scenes in many ways on the negotiations with the JCPOA, on trying to tamp down Iran. There was a case to be made that they were actually helping Israel by keeping Iran at bay in Syria, for example. And in North Korea, they were helping us behind the scenes on, keeping Kim Jong-un and the North Koreans somewhat contained, and not now. And that also then shifts the strategic balance. Russia wasn't really thought of as a player in that part of the Northeast Asia by the Chinese as well, thinking that they had no leverage really with North Korea. Well, now North Korea's got some leverage with Russia, and suddenly Russia becomes a kind of an element in that dynamic that it might not have been in before, which again is why you've got South Korea and Japan, not just because of China, paying more attention to what's happening in Ukraine. So it sort of shifts all of the balance. In some regards, it might be more problematic from China's perspective. I don't think China, for example, wants to see more of a blow-up in the Middle East. I mean, that's where most of China's energy is coming from. And China would have liked to play a more even-handed role. But, in the Northeast Asia region, China doesn't want to be left carrying, kind of all this baggage from North Korea either. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of, I think, complicated in many respects as well. But clearly, as Andrew's suggesting here, and all of us should be very well aware, that any kind of win for Russia in the course of Ukraine would definitely embolden Iran and North Korea in their own regions, and also would be seen as something of a win for China because of course, it supported Russia throughout all of this after the first meetings between Putin and Xi on the margins of the Beijing Olympics.
Although it would really complicate,
it would complicate, I think, China's life.
Relationship
exactly.
with Europe. Yeah.
But I think at the same time, if Xi doesn't want to see Putin, lose face, let alone, lose, this is a major factor.
Okay, so but how crucial, and this will be the last.
Is there a question about that on the list as well?
There's a question right here.
Right. Okay, good. Convenient.
But how crucial do you each think the relationship with China is to Russia? I mean, is it fundamental? Is it lasting? Is it invariably going to deepen? What's your view of it? I mean, especially from a Russia perspective.
I think it's of cardinal importance for the Putin regime, and this unabashed embrace of China, both to keep the Russian economy afloat, to supply the Russian defense industrial base with important components, as Secretary Blinken and others have been speaking at length in recent weeks. And then lastly, as a counterbalance to us, and as a ability to kind of, create a new multipolar world, as the Russians have been talking for decades. This is the partnership that really matters And the Russians have put themselves in a subordinate position. So those asymmetries will grow over time because Russia's economy is not expanding. China's is. Russia is technologically backward. China's the opposite. Russia has, some stuff that it provides to China, but it's a buyer's market for most of those items. So the Chinese are, they're not sentimental. They're not, providing charity to Russia. They're extracting concessions wherever possible. And, Putin dresses this up in geopolitical terms, but, it looks, to I think any sane observer, like, Russia is willing to be a vassal of China, as our colleague Alexander Gabuyev has written. So it's, it's a dim picture in terms of Russia's strategic advantage. But if the goal is to stick it to the United States and to outlast in Ukraine, and I think those are the, and to protect his own regime, if that's the, the three talking points of what Putin thinks about every morning, it's a useful tool.
Fiona?
Yeah, I think in that regard, and I'm glad Andrew, brought up Alexander Gabuyev, because he was really at the forefront of describing very clearly, for everybody who's reading all of his work here at Carnegie when he was in Moscow and now outside, of really showing how much that relationship had changed. Because if I take back to that 20 odd years ago, I wrote a piece a long time ago with Bobo Lowe, the Australian British former diplomat, has also got Chinese ancestry, where we depicted a Russian-Chinese relationship that was very tense and had more contradictions than compatibilities. Well, we were wrong, and why we were wrong was because of this element of the United States. Because as Russia and China both started to see the United States becoming more of a threat, it created a kind of a pivot, for that relationship that really, I think, pushed to the background all of the tensions in the relationship that were historic, or the economic asymmetries. And you see that very clear in Ukraine. Getting back to something I said before, that China doesn't have any particular beef with Ukraine. China, basically this is about us. It's a kind of a proxy war against the United States for Iran and North Korea in helping Russia, and also for China. It's about China's dissatisfaction with the economic relationship with the United States, and with all the sanctions, and watching how the United States has been responding to Russia and hoping to head that off, or it's wondering if this really is a dress rehearsal for how we might react if China did something on Taiwan, for example. And so I would like to see what that relationship might look like between China and Russia, say 20 years down the line, if there was a fundamental shift in US-China relations. So if we don't head towards the inevitable conflict that people keep talking about with Taiwan, we tamp that relation down, there was a shift in the calculus of both China and the United States for whatever reasons, or with Europe as well, that we came to some other modus vivendi with China, how then that would affect that relationship with Russia down the line. Because as you say, it's cardinal now for Russia, and increasingly so over time, but does it remain cardinal for China over the longer term, I think, is really the question.
China could have an enormous influence in this more positive scenario in US-China relations.
It could.
We don't know where
we
we're
just
going to be
don't know.
in 10
But
years.
if we were just projecting forward from where we are right now, it seems unlikely. But all kinds of things that seemed unlikely have happened.
Of course.
And we could see a shift at some point in the US-China relationship.
Well, I think a growing number of people are arguing that could be in the 2030s if we can get through the dangerous moment.
If we can get through the dangerous time now. And then Russia would be very much in that disadvantaged position. And then those tensions, particularly territorial, as Russia sits on so much territory that it took, just like other European powers from China back in the 1860s in the Qing dynasty. And the Chinese, I've got all of those places with still the Chinese names on their maps. My one and only trip to China, which does not make me an expert, I was in the room with a big map, and I thought, hang on, that's Russia, isn't it, over there? But the colouring seems to have bled very far north, and there's Chinese characters. And I asked my colleague in the office, what's the name of that city? And it's all the Chinese cities for places like Vladivostok and other places that I had no idea that they had a Chinese name, for example.
Andrew, Fiona, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. And thanks to all of you for coming and joining us here for this episode of Pivotal States.